2 narrow stretches of water, that's all it takes to threaten a fifth of the world's oil supply. For months, the Strait of Hormuz has dominated headlines. The choke point at the mouth of the Persian Gulf that Iran effectively shut down when its war with the United States broke out in February. But this week, a second choke point entered the picture, Bab al-Mandab, the strait separating Djibouti and Yemen, whose name literally means Gate of Grief, and its closure might matter just as much. This is the story of how a regional oil workaround turned into the region's next major vulnerability, and why the next few weeks could decide whether this stays a two-country war or becomes something much bigger. When Iran shut the Strait of Hormuz in February, roughly 20 million barrels a day, about a fifth of global oil supply, was suddenly stranded. Countries scrambled for alternatives. The UAE rerouted about 1.5 million barrels daily through its Fujairah pipeline. Iraq pushed roughly 300,000 barrels a day toward Turkey. But the biggest adjustment came from Saudi Arabia. Using its east-west pipeline, Riyadh diverted around 4 million barrels a day away from the Gulf entirely, sending it instead to the Red Sea port of Yanbu. From there, about 1 million barrels headed north through the Suez Canal toward Europe, but the majority, some 3 million barrels a day, went south out through Bab al-Mandab toward Asia. It worked. Analysts even called Yanbu the last lifeline, keeping global energy markets from a full-blown collapse. By June, traffic through Bab al-Mandab had roughly tripled compared to pre-war levels, and Saudi oil accounted for almost all of that increase. But there was a catch. Many of the supertankers loading at Yanbu are simply too large to pass through the Suez Canal. Their draft is too deep, so the workaround only worked in one direction, south through Bab al-Mandab. And Bab al-Mandab's eastern shore is controlled by one group, the Houthis. In escaping Hormuz, Saudi Arabia had walked straight into range of a different threat. For nearly 4 years, an unofficial truce had held between the Houthis and Saudi Arabia, dating back to a 2022 ceasefire in Yemen's civil war. That truce broke down over, of all things, a funeral. Following the death of Iran's supreme leader, Iran arranged to fly a Houthi delegation to Tehran for the memorial. That meant reopening Sanaa airport to Iranian aircraft for the first time since 2015, something Saudi Arabia had long treated as a red line, worried it would become a direct pipeline for Iranian weapons and personnel into Yemen. The first flight landed despite Saudi fighter jets attempting to intercept it. A second landed too. When a third Iranian flight approached, Saudi Arabia acted, striking the runway at Sanaa airport to prevent it from landing. The plane was diverted to the Red Sea port of Hodeidah instead. Notably, Saudi forces destroyed the runway rather than shooting down the aircraft, a calculated, limited response. The Houthis didn't see it that way. They retaliated with a missile and drone barrage on Abha airport in southern Saudi Arabia, a strike larger than initially reported based on the volume of footage that circulated on social media, even as mainstream coverage stayed muted. Saudi Arabia, notably, did not respond. It didn't matter. On Monday, Houthi military spokesman Yahya Saree announced what analysts had feared for months: a full naval blockade on Saudi-linked shipping through Bab al-Mandab. The 4-year truce was officially over. It's tempting to write off Houthi threats as bluster. That would be a mistake. Between 2023 and 2024, the Houthis proved they could paralyze the world's busiest shipping corridor for a year and a half, using a relatively cheap arsenal: anti-ship missiles, aerial and naval drones, remote-controlled explosive boats, and sea mines. They shot down more than 20 American Reaper drones, expensive targets brought down with inexpensive weapons. The group forced major shipping firms to reroute entirely around the African continent rather than risk the transit. That's the real threat here. Not necessarily a hard blockade of every single ship, but enough uncertainty to spike insurance costs, spook operators, and rattle markets, all without a single choke point being officially shut. And the numbers back up why this matters so much. Before the wider war, Bab al-Mandab carried around 2 million barrels a day, mostly Russian oil bound for Asia. By June, that had climbed to roughly 6 million barrels a day, almost entirely due to the Saudi rerouting. If that flow drops to zero, which is explicitly the Houthis' stated goal against Saudi shipping, the global shortfall could jump from about 15 million barrels a day, where it sits with Hormuz closed, to somewhere near 18 million. And that number could climb further if Houthi strikes become less selective, or if fear alone keeps non-Saudi vessels away too. Rerouting around Africa isn't a real fix either. It adds roughly 6,000 kilometers and about 2 weeks to each voyage, meaning less oil reaches the market regardless, forcing the rest of the world to burn through already strained stockpiles even faster. Some analysts go further, warning that if the Houthis escalate beyond a shipping blockade to threatening the ports themselves, Yanbu specifically, this stops being purely an oil story. Yanbu also handles food and goods bound overland for Gulf states. Choke that off, and you're not just talking energy markets, you're talking regional food security. Here's the harder question. Is this a Houthi decision, or an Iranian one wearing a Houthi mask? The honest answer is probably both. The Houthis frame this as a direct, proportionate response to Saudi Arabia, the airport strike, the alleged siege of Sanaa. That's not an unreasonable narrative on its face, but the timing is difficult to ignore. Assad has fallen in Syria. Hezbollah has been badly degraded in Lebanon. Iran itself is absorbing heavy losses in its war with the United States. Of Iran's old regional network, the Houthis are essentially the last card left standing, geographically distant, and the hardest node for adversaries to reach and neutralize. Whether Tehran is pulling strings directly or simply benefiting from a proxy acting in its own interest, the effect is the same. A new front opens, adversaries get stretched thinner, and the world is reminded the broader axis isn't fully dismantled yet. Reporting also suggests the closure decision may not have been the Houthis alone to make, that Iran effectively greenlit or directed the move. If that's accurate, it changes the calculus for anyone hoping negotiations with the Houthis alone could resolve this. Even if Saudi Arabia offered concessions, reopening Sanaa airport for instance, there's no guarantee Bab al-Mandab reopens in return, because the leverage sits in Tehran, not Sanaa. So what does Saudi Arabia do? There are real reasons for Riyadh to avoid a full military response. A war with the Houthis risks drawing in Iran directly again, and possibly Iran-aligned militias in Iraq, reopening multiple fronts at once. It risks depleting Saudi air defenses at a moment when American missile stockpiles are already stretched thin from the broader war. It risks destabilizing overland routes that Gulf neighbors like Bahrain, Kuwait, and Qatar depend on for food and trade. And the full war would likely spike energy prices even further, which could shorten Washington's political tolerance for its own war effort. But Saudi Arabia has also shown it has a real red line: the strike on Sanaa's runway. Executed knowing retaliation was likely, shows a willingness to act decisively when a threshold is crossed. Regional solidarity has already shown up quickly. Gulf states issued statements backing Saudi Arabia within a day of the blockade announcement, and reports point to Saudi surveillance aircraft operating near Iranian coastal areas, a signal that Riyadh's options aren't purely defensive. Strip away the details and the structure becomes clear. Bab al-Mandab is functioning as Hormuz's mirror image. If Iran is squeezing the world at the Gulf's entrance, the Houthis are squeezing it at the Red Sea's exit. Between those two gates sits roughly a fifth of the world's oil. Choke both simultaneously, and you're not looking at a regional inconvenience. You're looking at a global energy shock, with Asian economies especially exposed, given how much regional oil they depend on. From here, a handful of scenarios are on the table. Saudi Arabia could launch a broader military campaign against the Houthis, reigniting Yemen's civil war after 4 years of relative calm. International powers could step in to protect shipping lanes directly, as happened during the 2023-24 Red Sea crisis. Or regional diplomacy could work to defuse things before they spiral. Everyone involved seems to understand that a simultaneous crisis at both straits is a catastrophe nobody actually wants. What this moment really confirms is an old truth about the Middle East. Its leverage was never just about armies. It's about geography. A handful of narrow waterways where closing just one can make the whole world hold its breath. Right now, 2 relatively small actors sit at 2 of the most consequential gates on the planet: Iran at Hormuz, the Houthis at Bab al-Mandab, and the global economy is waiting to see which one moves first and how far the other side is willing to let it go. Whether this stays contained to a shipping dispute or becomes the spark for a much wider regional war may come down to a single decision in Riyadh in the days ahead.